Have you ever tried to tell someone you're drowning, only to have them tell you the water isn't real? Because that's exactly what happened when I tried to explain my depression to my parents, and what they discovered later made them realize just how dangerously wrong they were. My name is Lyra Ashvell, and from wherever you're watching this, stay with me. This is about the day my mother found a letter hidden in my bedroom drawer. A letter that wasn't meant to be found until it was too late. A letter that made my father, who once said, "Depression is just weakness disguised as an illness," break down crying in our kitchen at 2 a.m. This is about how my parents spent years telling me to just get over it and stop being dramatic, until they almost lost me forever. And how that terrifying wake-up call didn't just save my life. It transformed our entire family's understanding of mental health and led to something beautiful I never could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It was a Tuesday morning in our Willowbrook kitchen when I finally found the courage to tell my parents I was drowning. Not literally, of course, but in a way that felt just as terrifying and suffocating. I had been planning this conversation for weeks, rehearsing the words in my head during sleepless nights, practicing in front of my bedroom mirror until my reflection looked as exhausted as I felt. "Mom, Dad, I need to talk to you about something important," I said, setting down my untouched bowl of cereal. My hands were shaking slightly, but I pressed them against the cool marble countertop to steady myself. My father, Matthias Drelin, barely looked up from his morning newspaper. He was the kind of man who believed in solutions, not problems. At 52, he ran Drelin Construction with an iron fist and the philosophy that hard work could fix anything. "Make it quick, Lyra," he said, flipping to the sports section. "I have a meeting with the Thornfield Mall contractors in an hour." My mother, Cynthia Lorick, was bustling around the kitchen in her usual Tuesday routine, preparing for her shift at Willowbrook General Hospital where she worked as a surgical nurse. She'd been there for 15 years and prided herself on being someone who could handle any crisis with calm efficiency. "What's wrong, sweetie?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was already half listening, mentally reviewing her patient charts. I took a deep breath. This was it. "I think I'm struggling with depression, and I need help." The kitchen fell silent except for the soft hum of our refrigerator and the distant sound of morning traffic on Elm Street. My father's newspaper crinkled as he slowly lowered it, and my mother stopped mid-motion, a coffee mug frozen halfway to her lips. Then my father laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but the kind of dismissive chuckle you might give to someone who claimed they could fly. "Depression? Lyra, you're 23 years old with a college degree, a good job at Morrison Marketing, and a roof over your head. What could you possibly be depressed about?" "It's not about having things to be sad about," I tried to explain, feeling my carefully rehearsed words beginning to crumble. "It's like there's this weight pressing down on me constantly. I can barely get out of bed some mornings. I cry for no reason. I feel empty inside. Like I'm just going through the motions of being alive, but not actually living." My mother set down her mug with a sharp clink. "Lyra, honey, that's just life. Everyone feels tired sometimes. Everyone has bad days. You can't just slap a medical label on normal human emotions and expect the world to stop for you." "But this isn't normal tired, Mom. This is different. I've felt this way for months, maybe even years. It's getting worse. Yesterday, I sat in my car for 20 minutes in the Morrison parking lot because I couldn't force myself to walk inside. Last week, I called in sick 3 times because the thought of facing people felt impossible." My father folded his newspaper with deliberate precision, a gesture I knew meant his patience was wearing thin. "You know what your problem is, Lyra? You've been coddled your whole life. Everyone gets a trophy. Everyone's feelings matter. Everyone needs therapy for every little thing. Back when I was your age, you know what we called depression? We called it Tuesday. You got up, you went to work, you handled your business. You didn't sit around feeling sorry for yourself. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had expected some resistance, maybe some confusion, but not this complete dismissal of something that felt so real and overwhelming in my daily life. Dad, I'm not asking for pity. I'm asking for help. I think I need to see someone. Maybe get some professional guidance. Professional guidance? My mother's voice carried that particular tone she used when she thought someone was being ridiculous. Lyra, I see real problems every day at the hospital. People fighting cancer. People in car accidents. People dealing with actual medical emergencies. What you're describing sounds like you need to get more exercise, maybe find a hobby, possibly spend less time on social media comparing your life to other people's highlight reels. I felt something inside me starting to crack. These were the people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally, and they were treating my cry for help like a minor inconvenience. This isn't about social media or exercise, Mom. I wake up every morning wishing I hadn't. I go to bed every night hoping I won't wake up. That's not normal. My father's expression hardened. Now you're being dramatic. You want to know what depression really looks like? It looks like my father during the recession of '91 when he lost his business and had to take a job mopping floors to keep food on the table. Even then, he didn't sit around talking about his feelings. He did what needed to be done. Matthias is right, my mother added, moving to rinse her coffee mug in the sink. You've always been a sensitive person, Lyra, and there's nothing wrong with that. But sensitivity isn't a mental illness. It's a personality trait. What you need is perspective, not pills. I stared at them both, feeling more alone in that moment than I had in months of actual solitude. So you're saying that what I'm feeling isn't real? That I'm just making this up for attention? We're saying that you're a smart, capable young woman who has let herself get convinced that normal life challenges are some kind of medical condition, my father replied, standing up and straightening his tie. Depression isn't real the way cancer is real, Lyra. It's a trendy excuse for people who don't want to take responsibility for their own happiness. My mother nodded in agreement. Honey, I love you, but you can't therapy your way out of being an adult. What you need is to stop overthinking everything and start doing. Join a gym, take a cooking class, maybe start dating again. Fill your time with productive activities instead of sitting around analyzing your emotions. The conversation that I had hoped would be a turning point became instead a confirmation of my worst fears, that my pain wasn't valid, that my struggles weren't real, that I was fundamentally weak for not being able to just get over it like everyone else apparently could. I need to get to work, my father announced, grabbing his keys from the counter hook. Lyra, I hope you'll think about what we've said. Sometimes the best therapy is just deciding to be happy. As he walked toward the garage door, he turned back, with what he probably thought was an encouraging smile. You're a Draylen, sweetheart. We don't do depression. We do determination. My mother kissed my forehead before heading to gather her hospital badge and purse. We love you, Lyra. That's why we're being honest with you instead of enabling this. You'll thank us later when you realize you didn't need expensive therapy sessions to feel better about your life. And then they were gone, leaving me sitting alone in the kitchen with my untouched cereal and the crushing realization that the two people who were supposed to understand me most had just told me that my deepest pain was imaginary. I sat there for another hour, staring at the morning light filtering through our kitchen windows, watching dust particles dance in the sunbeams while feeling more isolated than I had ever felt in my entire life. The conversation I had hoped would be the beginning of getting help had instead become another weight added to the crushing load I was already carrying. That morning, for the first time, I understood that I was completely on my own. This wasn't the first time my parents had dismissed my emotional struggles. I realized as I sat in that empty kitchen. Looking back, I could trace a pattern that stretched all the way back to my teenage years. A consistent thread of minimization and invalidation that I had somehow convinced myself was normal. When I was 16 and struggling with anxiety about college applications, my father had found me crying over my SAT prep books one evening. Instead of asking what was wrong, he'd shaken his head and said, "Lyra, successful people don't cry about challenges. They conquer them." When I tried to explain that I felt overwhelmed and scared about my future, he'd patted my shoulder and told me, "Fear is just excitement without breath. Stop being dramatic." My mother's approach had always been more subtle but equally dismissive. During my senior year of high school, when I was having panic attacks about graduation and leaving home, she'd suggested I was probably just getting too much caffeine and recommended switching to herbal tea. When the panic attacks continued, she'd taken me to our family doctor, Dr. Whitmore, who'd spent 5 minutes asking basic questions before concluding I was a normal teenager experiencing normal stress and recommending more sleep and exercise. Preparing. And narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. College had been particularly difficult. I'd chosen Millbrook University partly because it was only 2 hours from home, but the adjustment to dorm life and academic pressure had been overwhelming. During my freshman year, I'd called home crying several times, trying to explain that I felt lost and disconnected, that making friends seemed impossibly difficult, that I felt like I was watching everyone else navigate college life successfully while I struggled with basic daily tasks. "Homesickness is normal," my mother had said during one of these calls. "Everyone goes through it. You just need to push through and get involved in more activities." My father had been more direct. "Lyra, we didn't invest in your education for you to call home crying every week. College is supposed to challenge you. That's the point. If it were easy, everyone would have a degree." By sophomore year, I'd learned to stop calling when things got bad. Instead, I'd developed a pattern of putting on a cheerful voice during our weekly check-ins, telling them about classes and activities while carefully editing out any mention of the days I couldn't get out of bed, the nights I'd sit in my dorm room staring at homework I couldn't focus enough to complete, or the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the way I experienced the world. When I'd come home for winter break that year, visibly thinner and quieter than usual, my parents had attributed it to college stress and recommended I eat more protein and get some fresh air. They'd scheduled family activities and invited relatives over, treating my obvious struggle as something that could be cured with holiday cheer and home-cooked meals. The pattern continued through college and into my early 20s, when I'd graduated and moved back home temporarily. While job hunting, I'd gone through a particularly dark period where I slept 14 hours a day and could barely motivate myself to shower or eat regularly. My parents had interpreted this as laziness. "You can't just hibernate until the perfect job falls into your lap," my father had announced one morning, finding me still in bed at noon. "Depression is a luxury for people who don't have responsibilities. You have student loans to pay and a life to build." My mother had been more concerned about appearances. "What are we supposed to tell people when they ask what you're doing with your life? That you're taking a mental health break? Lyra, that's not how the real world works." They'd implemented what they called structure to help me get back on track. Mandatory wake-up times, chore assignments, and daily job application quotas. When I tried to explain that the problem wasn't lack of structure but rather a profound emptiness and hopelessness that made even simple tasks feel monumental, they'd dismissed it as excuses. "Everyone feels unmotivated sometimes," my mother had said. "The difference between successful people and unsuccessful people is that successful people do what needs to be done, whether they feel like it or not." Even when I'd finally found my position at Morrison Marketing and moved into my own apartment in downtown Willowbrook, the pattern of dismissal had continued during family dinners and phone calls. Any mention of stress, sadness, or struggle was met with practical solutions or gentle criticism. When I'd mentioned feeling isolated in my new apartment, they'd suggested I join a book club or volunteer somewhere. When I'd talked about feeling disconnected from my coworkers, they'd recommended I try being more positive and outgoing. When I'd admitted that some days I felt like I was just going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive, they'd told me I needed to find a purpose and stop being so self-focused. My father's favorite phrase had become, "Lyra, happiness is a choice. You can choose to focus on problems, or you can choose to focus on solutions." My mother preferred, "Sweetie, everyone has ups and downs. The key is not to dwell on the downs." Over the years, I had internalized their voices so completely that I'd begun to doubt my own experiences. When I felt overwhelmed, I told myself I was being dramatic. When I struggled to find joy in activities I used to love, I convinced myself I just needed to try harder. When getting through a single day felt like an enormous accomplishment, I criticized myself for being weak. I'd developed elaborate systems for hiding my struggles. I kept backup activities planned, so I'd always have something positive to report during family calls. I'd learned to schedule social media posts in advance, so my online presence looked consistently upbeat. I'd gotten skilled at deflecting concerned questions from friends with humor and subject changes. The most painful part was watching how they interacted with other people's mental health struggles. When my cousin Arendor had been diagnosed with clinical anxiety during his junior year at State University, my parents had been surprisingly supportive, helping his parents research therapists and even contributing to the cost of his treatment. "It's different," my mother had explained when I'd asked about the apparent contradiction. "Arendor has a legitimate medical condition. His anxiety is genetic. It runs in his father's family. What you're describing is just life stress." When our neighbor, Mrs. Vailcrest, had gone through a bout of depression after her husband's death, my parents had been full of compassion, bringing casseroles and offering to help with yard work. "Grief depression is understandable," my father had said. "She has a real reason to be sad." The implicit message was always the same. Other people's pain was valid and deserved support, but mine was a character flaw that needed correction. Looking back from that kitchen table, I could see how years of this pattern had shaped my relationship with my own mental health. I'd learned to minimize my struggles, to question my own perceptions, to believe that what I was experiencing wasn't bad enough to warrant help or concern. I'd become an expert at presenting a functional exterior while privately drowning, at maintaining the appearance of someone who had everything together while internally feeling like I was falling apart. I'd learned to be grateful for good days and ashamed of bad ones, to treat my depression like a personal failing rather than a medical condition. The morning conversation in the kitchen wasn't an anomaly. It was the culmination of a lifetime, of having my emotional reality dismissed, minimized, and reframed as a choice I was making rather than an experience I was enduring. And as I sat there alone, surrounded by the familiar walls and furniture of my childhood home, I realized that nothing was going to change unless I changed it myself. My parents weren't going to suddenly understand or validate my experience. They weren't going to encourage me to seek help or offer to support me through treatment. If I was going to survive this, I was going to have to do it entirely on my own. 3. Months after that kitchen conversation, I had learned to perfect the art of appearing fine. I'd gotten a promotion at Morrison Marketing, started going to a weekly yoga class my mother had suggested, and maintained what looked like a normal social life to anyone observing from the outside. My parents were pleased with these developments, often commenting during family dinners about how much better I seemed since I'd stopped focusing on negative thoughts. But the truth was that each day had become a carefully choreographed performance of functionality. I'd wake up each morning and mentally rehearse the day's requirements: shower, dress professionally, drive to work, engage with colleagues, complete assignments, return home, eat something, repeat. It was like following a script written by someone else, going through the motions of a life that felt increasingly hollow and meaningless. The promotion at work had actually made things worse rather than better. The additional responsibilities meant longer hours and more pressure, but I couldn't explain to anyone that what looked like success from the outside felt like an unbearable weight pressing down on me. My new position required me to lead client presentations and manage junior staff members, tasks that demanded energy and enthusiasm I simply didn't have. I'd become an expert at what I privately called performance happiness, the ability to laugh at appropriate moments during meetings, ask engaging questions during client calls, and maintain the kind of positive attitude that my supervisor, Julian Maraway, praised during performance reviews. But the effort required to sustain this facade was exhausting in ways I couldn't articulate to anyone. The yoga classes my mother had recommended became another source of internal conflict. While she saw my attendance as proof that I was taking positive action, I experienced each session as a stark reminder of how disconnected I felt from my own body and emotions. Surrounded by people who seemed to genuinely find peace and joy in the practice, I felt like an imposter going through the motions trying to breathe life into a body that felt increasingly foreign to me. My apartment on Maple Street had become both a sanctuary and a prison. It was the only place where I could drop the performance and allow myself to exist without pretending. But existing in that raw, unguarded state had become almost unbearable. I'd spend entire weekends lying on my couch, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of time passing without any sense of purpose or direction. Sleep had become my primary escape, but even that refuge was being compromised by increasingly vivid dreams and frequent periods of lying awake at 3 a.m., mentally rehearsing conversations I'd had during the day and critiquing my performance. Had I seemed enthusiastic enough during the team meeting? Had my laughter sounded genuine when Julian made jokes? Was anyone starting to suspect that something was wrong? The physical symptoms were getting harder to hide. I'd lost weight without trying, partly because food had become another task to complete rather than something I enjoyed. My clothes hung looser, and I'd started receiving comments about how thin I looked, which my mother interpreted as a positive side effect of the yoga classes, but which actually worried me. I felt fragile, like my body was consuming itself from the inside. Concentration had become nearly impossible. I'd sit at my desk at Morrison Marketing staring at project proposals and marketing campaigns, reading the same paragraphs over and over without absorbing any information. I'd developed elaborate systems for appearing productive while accomplishing very little, staying late at the office to complete work that should have taken half the time. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in November. I'd had a particularly difficult day at work, struggling through a client presentation that should have been routine but felt like climbing a mountain. Every smile, every confident statement, every moment of apparent competence had required enormous effort, and by the time I arrived home at my apartment, I felt completely depleted. I'd planned to work on a marketing analysis that was due the Yagyo next day, but found myself unable to focus on the documents spread across my kitchen table. Instead, I sat staring at my laptop screen, feeling the familiar weight of emptiness settling over me like a heavy blanket. That's when the thought appeared, not for the first time, but with a clarity and persistence that frightened me. What if I just didn't have to do this anymore? The thought wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was quiet and practical, like considering whether to cancel a subscription or change apartments. What if I could just stop the endless cycle of pretending, performing, and enduring? What if there was a way to simply not have to wake up tomorrow and face another day of feeling like I was drowning, while everyone around me insisted the water wasn't real? I found myself walking to my bedroom and sitting at the small desk where I usually paid bills and answered personal emails. Without consciously deciding to do so, I opened a notebook and began writing. The letter started as an attempt to explain what I had never been able to articulate successfully to my parents or anyone else. I wrote about the weight that pressed down on me every morning, the exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness, the sense of watching life happen around me without being able to participate in any meaningful way. I wrote about the loneliness of carrying a pain that no one believed was real, about the shame of being unable to choose happiness the way my father insisted was possible, about the fear that this emptiness would never end, and that I would spend the rest of my life pretending to be someone I wasn't. As I continued writing, the letter evolved into something I hadn't expected: a goodbye. Not a dramatic declaration, but a quiet explanation of why I couldn't continue the performance any longer. I wrote about how much I loved my parents despite their inability to understand what I was experiencing, how grateful I was for the good moments in my life, even though they felt increasingly rare and distant. I wrote about my hope that my decision would help them understand that what I had been trying to tell them was real, that depression wasn't a choice or a character flaw, but an illness that had gradually consumed every aspect of my existence. I apologized for not being strong enough to keep fighting, for disappointing them, for causing pain through my absence. The act of writing felt like the first honest thing I had done in months. For the first time in weeks, my mind felt clear and focused. I wasn't performing for anyone or trying to present a version of myself that would be acceptable to others. I was simply telling the truth about my experience, even if no one would read it until after I was gone. When I finished the letter, I folded it carefully and placed it in the top drawer of my bedroom dresser, underneath some old sweaters where it would eventually be found, but not immediately. I felt a strange sense of relief, as if I had finally completed an important task that had been hanging over me for months. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept deeply and dreamlessly. When I woke up the next morning, the clarity from the night before had been replaced by something unexpected, a tiny spark of curiosity about whether there might be another way forward, a path I hadn't yet considered. The letter was still in my dresser drawer, but the urgency to act on its contents had diminished slightly. Instead, I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone and thinking about the one option I had never seriously pursued, because my parents had convinced me it was unnecessary: professional help. For months, I had accepted their assessment that what I was experiencing didn't warrant therapy or medical intervention. But writing that letter had forced me to articulate the full extent of my struggle, and seeing it laid out in my own handwriting made it impossible to continue minimizing the severity of what I was enduring. Maybe my parents were wrong. Maybe what I was experiencing was real and serious and deserving of professional attention. Maybe there were people trained to understand and treat what I was going through, people who wouldn't dismiss my pain as a character flaw or a lifestyle choice. The thought was both terrifying and hopeful. Terrifying because it meant going against my parents' explicit wishes and beliefs, but hopeful because it suggested there might be a way forward that didn't involve the permanent solution I had outlined in the letter. That morning, instead of getting dressed for work, I called in sick and spent the day researching therapists in Willowbrook, reading about depression and anxiety disorders, and learning about treatment options I had never seriously considered. The letter remained in my dresser drawer, a reminder of how close I had come to a decision I couldn't take back, but also evidence of how desperately I needed help that went far beyond positive thinking and exercise classes. I had been seeing Dr. Joanne Hayes for 6 weeks when my parents found the letter. Those 6 weeks had been the most hopeful period I'd experienced in years, not because therapy was a magic solution, but because for the first time in my life, someone was treating my experience as real and worthy of serious attention. Dr. Hayes was everything my parents had convinced me a therapist wouldn't be: practical, intelligent, and focused on understanding the root causes of my depression rather than simply telling me to think more positively. She had diagnosed me with major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety, explaining that what I was experiencing had clear neurological and psychological components that could be treated with a combination of therapy and medication. For the first time in months, I had begun to feel like myself again, or at least like I was moving toward a version of myself that could function and maybe even find joy. The fog that had clouded my thinking was beginning to lift, and I was starting to believe that recovery might actually be possible. I had been keeping my therapy sessions secret from my parents, using sick days and extended lunch breaks to attend. appointments, paying out of pocket to avoid any possibility of them seeing insurance claims. Dr. Hayes had encouraged me to eventually share my treatment with them, but I wasn't ready to face their disapproval and skepticism, especially when therapy was working so well. The letter in my dresser drawer had remained untouched during those weeks. Sometimes I forgot it was there entirely, caught up in the progress I was making and the hope I was beginning to feel about my future. Other times, I would remember it and feel grateful that I hadn't acted on the desperation that had driven me to write it. Everything changed on a Saturday morning in early December. I had gone to an early therapy session and then stopped by Thornfield Shopping Center to pick up holiday gifts, feeling more optimistic about the upcoming family celebrations than I had in years. When I returned home to my apartment, I found both of my parents sitting in my living room, my mother holding the letter with trembling hands. The scene was so unexpected and surreal that for a moment I couldn't process what I was seeing. My parents rarely visited my apartment unannounced, and I couldn't immediately understand why they looked so devastated. "Lyra," my mother said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." That's when I saw the familiar handwriting on the pages in her hands and realized what had happened. My heart started racing as the implications hit me. They had found the letter, read it, and now knew exactly how close I had come to ending my life. "I was looking for your winter coat to borrow for the church fundraiser," my mother continued, tears streaming down her face. "You'd mentioned you had a nice wool one, and I thought you wouldn't mind. I was checking your bedroom closet when I knocked over some things in your dresser drawer." My father, who had been silent since I walked in, finally spoke. His voice sounded hoarse and strained in a way I'd never heard before. "Lyra, is this real? Did you really feel this way? Were you actually planning to hurt yourself?" I stood frozen in my doorway, still holding my shopping bags, trying to figure out how to respond. The letter had been written during one of my darkest moments, but I was no longer in that headspace thanks to therapy and treatment. How could I explain that yes, it had been real, but that I was getting better without them knowing? "Sit down, sweetheart," my mother said, patting the couch cushion beside her. "Please, we need to understand what's been happening." I moved slowly to the couch, setting down my bags and trying to prepare myself for a conversation I had never wanted to have. The letter between us felt like evidence of my deepest shame and vulnerability, my most private thoughts now exposed to the people who had spent years telling me those thoughts weren't valid. "Mom? Dad?" I began carefully. "That letter was written during a very difficult time. I'm doing better now. I've been getting help." My father's head snapped up. "Getting help? What kind of help? From who?" "I've been seeing a therapist, Dr. Joanne Hayes. She specializes in depression and anxiety disorders. She's been helping me understand what I've been going through and develop better coping strategies." The silence that followed was deafening. My parents exchanged a look that I couldn't quite interpret. Surprise, concern, maybe even guilt. "How long?" my mother asked quietly. 6 weeks. Since right after I wrote that letter, actually. Writing it made me realize how serious things had gotten, and I decided I needed professional help regardless of what anyone else thought about it. My father stood up abruptly and began pacing around my small living room. "You've been seeing a therapist for 6 weeks and didn't tell us? Lyra, we're your parents. We should have known you were struggling this badly." The irony of his statement was almost laughable, but I could see the genuine distress in both of their faces and realized this wasn't the time for sarcasm. "I didn't tell you because you'd made it very clear that you didn't believe depression was real or that therapy was necessary. I was afraid you'd try to talk me out of treatment." "But this letter," my mother said, holding up the pages again. "Lyra, you were talking about wanting to die, about feeling like you couldn't go on. How could we not have seen this?" That question opened a floodgate of emotions I hadn't expected. All the months of careful performance, of hiding my pain, of pretending to be fine while internally struggling to survive each day. Suddenly, it felt exhausting to maintain the facade even a moment longer. Because I got really good at hiding. I said, my own voice beginning to shake. Because every time I tried to tell you how I was feeling, you explained it away or told me to think differently or suggested I just needed more exercise. So I learned to smile when you were around and save the crying for when I was alone. My father stopped pacing and stared at me. We thought we were helping. We thought we were encouraging you to be strong. You were telling me that my pain wasn't real, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Do you know what it's like to feel like you're drowning and have the people you love most tell you the water is imaginary? My mother set the letter down on my coffee table and reached for my hands. Lyra, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. When I read this letter, when I saw how much you were hurting, I realized we completely missed what was happening. The worst part, I continued, was that I started to believe you. I started to think that maybe I was just weak. Maybe I was choosing to be miserable. Maybe everyone else had figured out some secret to being happy that I was too stupid or selfish to understand. My father sat back down heavily, his head in his hands. Jesus, Lyra, I told you happiness was a choice. I told you we don't do depression in this family. What kind of father says that to his daughter who's struggling? The raw pain in his voice was something I had never heard before. For years, he had been so confident in his assessments and advice, so sure that his approach was helping me build character and resilience. Seeing him grapple with the possibility that he had been not just wrong but harmful was almost as shocking as them finding the letter. You were trying to help in the way you knew how, I said, surprised by my own impulse to comfort them in this moment. You didn't know that depression is actually a medical condition, that it's not something you can just decide to stop having. My mother wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse. Tell us about this therapist. What has she been teaching you? What kind of treatment are you getting? For the next hour, I found myself explaining things I had learned about depression, anxiety, and mental health treatment. I told them about how Dr. Hayes had helped me understand that my brain chemistry was different, that the feelings I'd been experiencing had neurological causes that couldn't be addressed with willpower alone. I explained how therapy was helping me develop better coping mechanisms, how medication was being considered to help balance the chemical factors contributing to my depression, and how much relief I had felt when someone finally validated that my struggle was real and treatable. My parents listened intently, asking questions and taking notes on their phones. My father, who had always been skeptical of medical approaches he didn't understand, seemed particularly interested in the scientific aspects of depression treatment. So, when you wrote this letter, my mother asked eventually, you were seriously considering suicide? I nodded, feeling the weight of that admission. I was. Not in a dramatic way, but in a very practical, matter-of-fact way. It felt like the logical solution to a problem that couldn't be solved any other way. And now? My father asked. Now I understand that the problem can be solved in other ways. I'm not completely better yet, but I can see a path forward that doesn't involve giving up. Some days are still difficult, but I have tools now to manage the difficult days instead of just enduring them. As the afternoon wore on, I watched my parents grapple with a complete reframing of everything they thought. They knew about mental health, about me, and about their role in my struggle. The letter had forced them to confront the reality of how close they had come to losing me, and the shock of that possibility seemed to have shattered their previous certainties about depression being a choice or character flaw. By evening, when they finally prepared to leave, both of them looked emotionally exhausted, but also somehow different. Humbled, maybe, or just more aware of how much they didn't know about their own daughter's inner life. Lyra, my father said as he stood to leave, I want to learn more about this. About depression, about treatment, about how we can support you better. Can you give me some information to read? My mother hugged me tightly before walking to the door. "I'm so proud of you for getting help, sweetheart. I'm sorry it took finding that letter for us to realize how serious this was." After they left, I sat alone in my apartment, emotionally drained but also feeling something I hadn't expected. Hope that my relationship with my parents might actually improve, that they might learn to understand and support my mental health journey instead of opposing it. The letter that had once represented my darkest moment had become, unexpectedly, the catalyst for honest communication and potential healing in our family. The days following my parents' discovery of the letter were unlike anything I had experienced in our relationship. For the first time in years, they were actively seeking to understand something about me rather than trying to fix or change me. The shift was so dramatic that I initially wondered if it would last. But their commitment to learning about mental health proved to be genuine and sustained. My father, true to his word, had thrown himself into research with the same intensity. He applied to construction projects. Within a week of our conversation, he had ordered several books about depression and anxiety, bookmarked mental health websites, and even scheduled a consultation with Dr. Hayes to better understand my treatment plan. "I've been reading about neuroplasticity and serotonin uptake," he told me during a phone call, using terms I never expected to hear from the man who had once dismissed depression as a luxury for people without responsibilities. "Did you know that depression actually changes brain structure in measurable ways? This isn't about attitude or character at all." My mother had taken a different but equally committed approach. As a nurse, she was familiar with medical conditions and treatment protocols, but she admitted that mental health had been a blind spot in her professional knowledge. She had started attending a support group for families of people with depression and was learning about the ways that well-meaning family members could inadvertently make things worse. "I keep thinking about all the times I told you to just think more positively," she said during one of our newly frequent coffee meetings at Crescent Cafe on Willowbrook's Main Street. "I was essentially telling you to think your way out of a medical condition. I would never tell someone with diabetes to just think their way out of needing insulin. But somehow I thought depression was different." Dr. Hayes had been instrumental in facilitating these changes in my family dynamic. She had met individually with both of my parents, explaining the nature of depression and anxiety disorders, the evidence base for various treatments, and the ways that family support could aid in recovery. She had also provided them with concrete strategies for being helpful, rather than inadvertently harmful. "Your parents love you deeply," she told me during one of our sessions. "Their previous responses weren't malicious. They were based on misunderstanding and fear. Now that they're getting accurate information, they're capable of being tremendous allies in your healing process." The transformation wasn't just emotional, it was also practical. My parents had initially been concerned about the cost of therapy and potential medication, but they quickly shifted to viewing mental health treatment as an essential medical expense rather than an optional luxury. My father had even researched my insurance coverage and helped me understand my benefits so I could maximize my treatment options. My mother had used her connections at Willowbrook General Hospital to research psychiatrists who specialized in depression and anxiety, creating a list of potential providers in case I decided to explore medication as part of my treatment plan. Her medical background proved invaluable in helping the whole family understand the biological aspects of mental illness. "I've worked with patients who have cancer, heart disease, autoimmune disorders," she explained. "I would never question whether those conditions were real or suggest that patients could cure themselves with positive thinking. Mental illness deserves the same respect and comprehensive treatment approach." The evidence-building phase of our family's mental health education became a collaborative effort. My father had created detailed files of articles and research studies about depression treatment outcomes. My mother had compiled information about nutrition, exercise, and lifestyle factors that could support mental health alongside professional treatment. I had shared books and resources that Dr. Hayes had recommended, creating a family library of mental health information. We had also begun documenting my recovery process, not in a clinical way, but as a family seeking to understand what worked and what didn't. My parents had started keeping notes about our conversations, tracking my mood patterns, and identifying environmental factors that seemed to impact my mental state positively or negatively. "We want to be part of your support system," my father had said, "but we need to learn how to do that effectively. We can't just rely on good intentions. We need to understand the actual impact of our words and actions." This systematic approach extended to our communication patterns as well. Dr. Hayes had taught us about validation techniques, active listening skills, and ways to discuss mental health topics without triggering shame or defensiveness. We had practiced these skills during family sessions and gradually began implementing them in our regular interactions. My parents had also begun sharing their own emotional struggles more openly, acknowledging times when they had felt overwhelmed, anxious, or sad, but had dismissed these feelings as weaknesses rather than normal human experiences that sometimes required support and attention. "I've been thinking about my own father," my dad had admitted during one of our conversations. "He probably struggled with depression during that recession period I mentioned, but nobody talked about mental health back then. He just suffered in silence and expected everyone else to do the same. I inherited that approach without questioning whether it was actually helpful." The most significant development was their growing understanding of how their previous responses had affected my willingness to seek help and communicate openly about my struggles. They had begun apologizing not just for their initial reaction to my depression, but for years of subtle messages that had taught me to hide my emotional difficulties. "We created an environment where you felt like you had to pretend to be okay, even when you were falling apart," my mother had said. "That must have been incredibly lonely and frightening. We want to make sure you never feel that way again." They had also started advocating for mental health awareness in their own social circles. My father had begun discussing depression openly with his construction crew, sharing information about resources and encouraging his employees to take mental health seriously. My mother had started conversations with colleagues at the hospital about the importance of addressing mental health alongside physical health. "We spent years being part of the stigma problem," my father had explained. "Now, we want to be part of the solution, not just for our family, but for our community." The evidence they were building wasn't just about understanding my specific situation. It was about fundamentally changing their worldview regarding mental health and emotional well-being. They had moved from seeing therapy as a sign of weakness to viewing it as a sign of strength and self-advocacy. Dr. Hayes had praised their transformation during our family sessions. "Most families require months or even years to reach this level of understanding and support," she had observed. "Your parents' willingness to completely reconsider their assumptions and actively educate themselves is remarkable. By the end of 2 months, we had established new patterns of communication, new family traditions that prioritized mental health, and new systems for supporting each other through difficult periods. My parents had become knowledgeable advocates for mental health treatment, and I had gained the family support system I had always needed, but never thought possible." The letter that had once represented my deepest despair had ultimately become the foundation for building stronger, more authentic relationships with the people I loved most. The crisis had catalyzed a transformation that benefited not just me, but our entire family's approach to emotional health and well-being. What had started as evidence of my struggle had become evidence of our collective commitment to healing and growth. 6 months after my parents found the letter, our family's transformation had become impossible to contain within the walls of our home. What had started as a private crisis had evolved into something much larger, a ripple effect that would ultimately expose the mental health crisis hiding beneath Willowbrook's carefully maintained suburban facade. The catalyst came during the annual Willowbrook Community Health Fair, held every spring at Riverside Park. My mother, who had been volunteering with the hospital's booth for years, had convinced the organizers to include a mental health awareness station for the first time. She had enlisted Dr. Hayes to provide information about depression and anxiety disorders, and my father had used his connections through Draylen Construction to ensure the booth had prominent placement near the main entrance. I had been hesitant about participating, worried about the stigma of being publicly associated with mental health issues in our small town. But my parents had been so enthusiastic about sharing what they'd learned, and Dr. Hayes had convinced me that my story could help other people who were struggling in silence, that I eventually agreed to be part of their presentation. The morning of the health fair, I stood beside our booth watching my father arrange pamphlets about depression warning signs with the same meticulous attention he applied to construction blueprints. My mother was setting up a display of books and resources, while Dr. Hayes prepared to give mini presentations throughout the day about recognizing and addressing mental health concerns. I never imagined I'd be doing something like this, my father admitted as he adjusted the banner reading, "Mental Health Matters, Breaking the Silence." A year ago, I would have walked right past a booth like this, maybe even rolled my eyes at it. The fair officially opened at 9 a.m., and initially, our booth attracted the kind of polite but distant interest typical of topics people acknowledged as important, but didn't consider personally relevant. Visitors would pick up pamphlets, nod respectfully at Dr. Hayes's information, and move on to more comfortable subjects like blood pressure screenings and flu shots. Everything changed when Alessandra Corin approached our table around noon. Alessandra worked as a secretary at Willowbrook Elementary School and had been a fixture in our community for over 2 decades. She was known for her cheerful demeanor, her perfectly organized school events, and her seemingly endless energy for volunteer activities. She was the last person anyone would have associated with mental health struggles. But as she stopped in front of our display, her usual bright smile was nowhere to be seen. She picked up a pamphlet about depression symptoms, read it carefully, and then looked up at my mother, with tears in her eyes. "Cynthia," she said quietly, "can I ask you something privately?" My mother immediately guided her to a couple of chairs positioned beside our booth, away from the main crowd. I watched as Alessandra began speaking in urgent, whispered tones, occasionally glancing at the pamphlet in her hands. Within minutes, it became clear that Alessandra wasn't just seeking information for general interest. She was describing symptoms that perfectly matched what I had experienced during my darkest months, feelings she had been carrying secretly for years while maintaining her reputation as Willowbrook's most reliable and upbeat volunteer. "I thought I was losing my mind," I heard her tell my mother. "Some days I can barely get out of bed, but everyone expects me to be the person who has everything together. I've been hiding this for so long that I don't even know how to ask for help." Dr. Hayes had noticed the conversation and quietly joined them, providing professional perspective and resources while my mother offered the kind of personal understanding that only comes from watching a loved one navigate similar struggles. As word spread through the fair that someone was actually addressing mental health in concrete, practical ways, more people began approaching our booth with increasingly personal questions. By mid-afternoon, we had a small crowd gathered around Dr. Hayes as she explained the difference between normal sadness and clinical depression, the effectiveness of various treatment options, and the importance of seeking professional help. That's when the floodgates truly opened. Cedric Vance, who owned Vance Hardware on Main Street, admitted that he had been struggling with anxiety attacks for months, particularly since his wife's cancer diagnosis the previous year. He had been telling everyone he was handling things fine, but privately he was barely sleeping and had started avoiding social situations that used to bring him joy. Mira Soltran, a teacher at the high school, shared that she had been considering leaving her profession because the combination of work stress and what she now realized might be depression had made even simple classroom tasks feel overwhelming and impossible. Jorvin Straddle, a successful real estate agent, described symptoms of what Dr. Hayes recognized as possible bipolar disorder, mood swings he had been attributing to business stress, but which followed patterns that suggested a treatable medical condition. By the end of the day, Dr. Hayes had collected contact information for over 30 people who wanted to schedule consultations or learn about local mental health resources. My mother had distributed every pamphlet and book we'd brought, plus taken orders for additional materials. My father had filled pages in his notebook with names and phone numbers of community members who wanted to be contacted about forming a local mental health support network. But the most profound moment came when Orion Dreven approached our booth. Just before closing time, Orion was the principal of Willowbrook High School, a respected community leader known for his stern but fair approach to education. He was the kind of person who commanded respect through his presence alone, someone whose personal struggles would have been unimaginable to most residents. "I need to tell you something," he said to my parents and me, his usual commanding voice reduced to barely above a whisper. "My son Alex tried to kill himself last month." The silence that followed was deafening. Alex Thornwell was a senior at the high school, an honor student and athlete who appeared to have everything going for him. The idea that he had been struggling with suicidal thoughts was shocking enough, but the fact that his father, the school principal, felt comfortable sharing this information publicly demonstrated how dramatically the day had shifted community. Conversations about mental health. "We found him in time," Orion continued, "and he's getting help now. But I realized today, listening to all these people share their stories, that we've created a community where kids like Alex feel like they have to suffer in silence, where adults like me feel like admitting our families aren't perfect means admitting failure." He picked up one of Dr. Hayes' business cards and looked directly at me. "Your parents told me about your letter, about how close we came to losing you two. I want to change how we handle mental health in our schools, in our community. I want kids to know that asking for help is a sign of strength, not weakness." That conversation became the foundation for what would eventually become the Willowbrook Mental Health Initiative, a comprehensive program that provided counseling resources in schools, mental health first aid training for community leaders, and regular educational events for families. Within weeks of the health fair, the demand for mental health services in Willowbrook had increased by over 400%. Dr. Hayes had to bring in additional therapists to handle the volume of people seeking help. The local hospital had established a crisis intervention program. Several churches had started support groups for congregation members dealing with depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges. My parents had become inadvertent community leaders in the mental health awareness movement. My father was frequently asked to speak at local business meetings about recognizing signs of mental health struggles in employees. My mother had started a monthly support group for families dealing with mental illness, meeting in the conference room at Willowbrook General Hospital. But the most significant change was in how mental health was discussed in everyday conversations throughout the community. Topics that had once been whispered about or avoided entirely were now part of regular discussions at coffee shops, school board meetings, and neighborhood gatherings. The silence that had nearly killed me, that had trapped dozens of other community members in their own private struggles, had finally been broken in a way that seemed permanent and transformative. However, not everyone in Willowbrook embraced these changes. A vocal minority of residents began pushing back against what they saw as an overemphasis on mental health issues. They argued that the community was becoming too focused on problems rather than solutions, that encouraging people to seek therapy was creating a culture of victimhood rather than resilience. Carl Malrick, who served on the city council, had begun attending community meetings specifically to argue against funding mental health programs. "We're teaching our kids that every difficult emotion requires professional intervention," he would say. "What happened to personal responsibility and inner strength?" These opposing voices created tension throughout Willowbrook, dividing families and community organizations between those who supported expanded mental health resources and those who viewed such efforts as unnecessary coddling. The debate had become heated enough that local newspaper, the Willowbrook Gazette, had started running competing editorials about mental health policy. The conflict came to a head during a particularly contentious city council meeting where funding for school counseling programs was being debated. Carl Malrick had invited several speakers to argue against the proposed mental health initiatives, including a few community members who claimed that increased focus on mental health was actually causing more problems rather than solving them. Before all this mental health awareness started, one speaker argued, our kids handled problems on their own. Now every teenager thinks they need therapy for normal growing pains. That's when Alex Thornwell, Orion's son, stood up in the back of the crowded meeting room and asked to address the council. At 17, he was younger than most people who spoke at these meetings, but his presence commanded immediate attention. My name is Alex Thornwell, he said, his voice steady but emotional. 6 months ago, I tried to kill myself in my bedroom while my parents were downstairs watching TV. I had been planning it for weeks, but I never told anyone how I was feeling because I thought asking for help would make me weak. The room fell, completely silent. Even the council members who had been shuffling papers and checking phones were now focused entirely on Alex's words. I'm alive today because this community finally started talking about mental health as a real medical issue instead of a character flaw, he continued. I got professional help. I learned coping strategies, and I discovered that wanting to die wasn't a normal part of being a teenager that I just needed to tough out. He turned to face Carl Malrick directly. You're saying that teaching kids like me to seek help makes us weak, but I can tell you that the strongest thing I ever did was admitting I needed support and accepting it when it was offered. The impact of Alex's speech was immediate and profound. Several audience members were crying, including some who had previously been skeptical of mental health initiatives. The council voted unanimously to approve funding for expanded school counseling programs, and Carl Malrick never again spoke publicly against mental health resources. That night, as my parents and I drove home from the council meeting, I realized that our family's private crisis had catalyzed a complete transformation in how our entire community understood and addressed mental health. The letter that had once represented my deepest despair had become the first domino in a chain reaction that was saving lives throughout Willowbrook. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't written that letter? I asked my parents. As we sat in our driveway, none of us quite ready to end the evening's emotional intensity. My father turned around from the driver's seat. I think about it all the time, he said. Not just what would have happened to you, but what would have happened to all the people who got help because of the changes we've made. Alex Thornwell might not be alive today if this community hadn't learned to take mental health seriously. The crisis that had once threatened to destroy our family had instead become the foundation for healing that extended far beyond our own home, touching lives throughout our community in ways we never could have imagined. 2 years after the community health fair that changed everything, I stood in the lobby of the newly opened Willowbrook Mental Health Center, watching families walk through doors that represented hope rather than stigma. The building, converted from an old Victorian mansion on Oakwood Avenue, had become a symbol of how dramatically our community's approach to mental health had evolved. The center housed not only Dr. Hayes's expanded practice, but also crisis intervention, services, support groups, educational programs, and a specialized unit for adolescent mental health that had been inspired directly by Alex Thornwell's courage in sharing his story. It was exactly the kind of comprehensive resource I had needed during my darkest days. But more importantly, it ensured that other people wouldn't have to navigate their mental health struggles alone the way I had. My role in creating the center had evolved naturally from my involvement in community mental health advocacy. What had started as reluctant participation in that first health fair had grown into a passion for mental health education and policy development that surprised everyone, including myself. Working alongside Dr. Hayes and community leaders like Orion Dreven, I had discovered skills I never knew I possessed. My background in marketing at Morrison Industries turned out to be invaluable for developing educational materials and community outreach strategies. My personal experience with depression provided credibility and authenticity that professional credentials alone couldn't match. 6 months after the city council meeting where Alex had spoken so powerfully, I had made the decision to leave my position at Morrison Marketing and enroll in a master's program in mental health counseling at Riverside University. The transition had been both terrifying and exhilarating, representing the first major life decision I had made based on passion rather than expectation or obligation. "Are you sure this is what you want?" my father had asked when I told my parents about my career change. But his tone was completely different from the dismissive skepticism he might have shown years earlier. Now it carried genuine concern for my happiness and fulfillment, along with pride in my courage to pursue meaningful work. The graduate program had been challenging in ways that pushed me to grow beyond my previous limitations. Learning about trauma, neuroscience, and therapeutic techniques while simultaneously working through my own ongoing recovery had created a unique perspective that my professors and classmates valued. I was no longer just a former patient, but someone who could bridge the gap between personal experience and professional knowledge. My thesis project had focused on family-centered approaches to depression treatment, drawing heavily on my parents, transformation, and the broader community changes we had witnessed in Willowbrook. The research had attracted attention from mental health professionals throughout the state, leading to invitations to speak at conferences and contribute to professional publications. Dr. Hayes had become not just my therapist, but a mentor and colleague. She had encouraged me to consider specializing in family therapy, recognizing that my insights into how families could either support or hinder mental health recovery were particularly valuable. "You have a gift for helping people understand that mental health affects entire family systems," she had told me during one of our supervision sessions. "Your parents' journey from skepticism to advocacy demonstrates that even deeply held beliefs about mental illness can change when people are presented with accurate information and personal connection to the issue." The Willowbrook Mental Health Center had provided the perfect setting for me to complete my clinical training. Working with individuals and families who were facing challenges similar to what my own family had experienced, I found myself uniquely positioned to offer both professional competence and personal understanding. One of my most meaningful cases involved the Fenroe family, who had come to the center after their teenage daughter Veronica had been hospitalized following a suicide attempt. The parents, Kurt and Nadia Crestwell, exhibited the same initial resistance to mental health treatment that my parents had once shown. "We just don't understand why she would do something like this," Nadia had said during our first family session. "She has everything: good grades, college prospects, a loving family. What could she possibly be depressed about?" The familiar words took me back to my own kitchen conversation years earlier. But now I was on the other side of the equation, equipped with both professional training and personal insight to guide families through the same journey my parents had navigated. Over several months of family therapy, I watched the Crestwells undergo the same transformation my parents had experienced. They learned to recognize depression as a medical condition rather than a character flaw, developed communication skills that made their daughter feel heard rather than dismissed, and ultimately became advocates for mental health awareness in their own social circles. Veronica's recovery, supported by her family's newfound understanding and commitment to her mental health, became another success story that reinforced the center's approach to comprehensive, family-centered treatment. My work at the center had also led to unexpected opportunities for community education and policy development. I had been asked to serve on a statewide committee developing guidelines for mental health services in rural communities, drawing on Willowbrook's experience as a model for how small towns could address mental health needs effectively. The committee work had put me in contact with mental health advocates throughout the region, leading to collaborations on research projects and policy initiatives that extended far beyond our community. I had contributed to legislative testimony supporting funding for rural mental health programs, written articles for professional journals about community-based mental health initiatives, and developed training materials for healthcare providers, working in underserved areas. But perhaps the most rewarding aspect of my professional transformation had been the opportunity to work directly with young people who were facing the same struggles I had experienced. The adolescent program at the Willowbrook Mental Health Center had become my specialty, combining individual therapy with family education and school-based support services. Working with teenagers who felt hopeless and misunderstood, I was able to offer something unique, credible evidence that recovery was possible, that asking for help was courageous rather than weak, and that their pain was real and worthy of professional attention and family support. One particular case had resonated deeply with me. Lyra Norell was a 16-year-old who had been referred to our center after expressing suicidal thoughts to a school counselor. Her parents, both successful professionals, had initially approached treatment with the same skepticism and frustration my parents had once shown. "We've given her every advantage," her father had said. "Private school, music lessons, travel opportunities. We just can't understand why she's so unhappy all the time." Working with Lyra and her family over the course of several months, I was able to help them understand that depression doesn't discriminate based on privilege or opportunity. Her parents learned to recognize that their daughter's struggles were medical rather than moral, and gradually developed the skills to provide effective support rather than well-meaning but harmful advice. The breakthrough moment had come when Lyra's mother had brought in a letter she had found in her daughter's room, a letter that bore striking similarities to the one my parents had discovered in my dresser drawer years earlier. The parallel had created a powerful opportunity for connection and understanding that accelerated the family's progress significantly. Reading her words made me realize that we had been completely missing what she was trying to tell us. Lyra's mother had said, "Just like Lyra's parents had to learn, we had to accept that our daughter's pain was real and that our love alone wasn't enough to fix it." Today, Lyra was thriving in her senior year of high school, having found effective treatment for her depression and developed a strong support system within her family. Her parents had become volunteers at the mental health center, sharing their story with other families and advocating for improved mental health resources in local schools. These success stories had become the foundation for a book I was writing about family-centered approaches to adolescent mental health treatment. The book, titled "When Love Isn't Enough: A Family Guide to Supporting Teenage Mental Health," was scheduled to be published the following year by a major academic press. The writing process had been both challenging and cathartic, requiring me to revisit my own darkest moments, while also celebrating the transformation that had occurred in my family and community. Dr. Hayes had agreed to co-author several chapters, and my parents had contributed their own perspectives on learning to support a family member with mental illness. I never imagined that the worst period of our family's life would ultimately become the foundation for work that helps other families, my mother had said, while reviewing her contribution to the book. "It feels like we've been able to create something meaningful from what was once just pain." My father had expressed similar sentiments about the unexpected direction his life had taken since my crisis. In addition to his continued work with Draylen Construction, he had become a certified mental health first aid instructor, regularly teaching workshops for business leaders and community organizations throughout the region. "I spent 50 years thinking that mental health was a luxury for people who didn't have real problems," he had said during a recent presentation. "My daughter's near-death experience taught me that mental health is actually the foundation that makes everything else in life possible." The personal transformation had extended beyond professional and advocacy work to encompass every aspect of my daily life. The skills I had learned in therapy, mindfulness techniques, cognitive behavioral strategies, stress management tools, had become integrated into my routine in ways that supported ongoing mental wellness. I had also developed a strong support network that extended far beyond my family to include colleagues, friends, and community members who understood the importance of mental health maintenance. Regular therapy sessions, exercise, creative outlets, and meaningful work had created a lifestyle that supported emotional stability rather than merely managing crisis. The relationship with my parents had evolved into something deeper and more authentic than what we had shared before my crisis. Our communication was more honest, our boundaries were healthier, and our mutual support was based on understanding rather than assumptions or expectations. "We're better parents now than we were when you were growing up," my mother had admitted recently. "Not because we love you more, but because we understand you better and know how to show that love in ways that actually help rather than hurt." The journey from suicidal despair to professional fulfillment and community leadership had taught me that crisis could become catalyst, that the most painful experiences could be transformed into sources of strength and service to others. Standing in the lobby of the mental health center that had grown from our family's darkest moment, watching other families begin their own journeys toward healing and understanding, I felt grateful for the path that had brought me to this point. The letter that had once represented my desire to escape life had ultimately become the foundation for building a life worth living, not just for myself, but for the countless others who would benefit from the changes our crisis had set in motion. 5 years have passed since my parents found that letter in my dresser drawer, and as I write this, I'm sitting in my office at the Willowbrook Mental Health Center, preparing for what has become the most important day of each year in our community, Mental Health Awareness Day. What started as a small booth at a health fair has grown into a weekend-long festival that draws visitors from across 3 counties, featuring workshops, support groups, art therapy exhibitions, and stories of recovery that inspire hope in people who are still struggling. Today marks something even more significant: the 5th anniversary of the day Alex Thornwell stood up in that city council meeting and saved not just the funding for mental health programs, but changed how our entire region thinks about emotional well-being. Alex, now 22 and a senior at State University studying psychology, will be this year's keynote speaker, sharing how his near-death experience became the foundation for a life dedicated to helping others navigate their darkest moments. The transformation in our community has exceeded every optimistic projection we made in those early days. The Willowbrook Mental Health Center now employs 12 full-time therapists, has a waiting list that extends into neighboring communities, and operates satellite programs in 4 surrounding towns. The Crisis Intervention Program has responded to over 800 emergency calls in the past year alone, and our follow-up data shows that 89% of people who accessed our services report significant improvement in their mental health within 6 months. But the numbers, as impressive as they are, don't tell the complete story of what has changed in Willowbrook. The real transformation is visible in smaller, daily interactions throughout our community. In the way teachers now recognize signs of depression and anxiety in their students instead of dismissing them as behavioral problems. In the way employers provide mental health resources alongside physical health care benefits. In the way families have learned to talk openly about emotional struggles without shame or stigma. Last month, I received a letter that perfectly captured this shift. It came from Mariel Draven, a local business owner whose teenage son had been struggling with severe anxiety. 5 years ago, she wrote, her family would have handled the situation by telling him to toughen up and stop worrying so much. Instead, they had immediately connected him with appropriate treatment, attended family therapy sessions to learn how to provide better support, and created an environment where he felt safe discussing his mental health needs. My son is thriving now, her letter continued, not because his anxiety disappeared, but because he learned how to manage it effectively, and our family learned how to be part of his support system instead of part of his stress. 5 years ago, we would have been ashamed to admit our family needed help. Now we're proud advocates for mental health awareness, and we know our son will grow up understanding that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness. Stories like Marielle's arrive regularly now, from parents who credit our community's mental health transformation with saving their relationships with their children, from individuals who found the courage to seek treatment because mental health support became normalized rather than stigmatized, from families who learned to communicate about emotional struggles instead of pretending they didn't exist. My own family's journey continues to evolve in ways that surprise and inspire me. My parents, now in their early 60s, have become regional leaders in family mental health advocacy. My father speaks regularly at business conferences about creating mentally healthy workplaces, while my mother has developed training programs for medical professionals on recognizing and addressing mental health concerns in primary care settings. Their marriage has grown stronger through this process as well. Learning to support me through depression treatment taught them communication and emotional skills that enhanced their own relationship. They've shared openly about seeking couples counseling to work through some of the guilt and grief they experienced when they realized how their previous attitudes had contributed to my isolation and despair. We had to learn to forgive ourselves for not knowing better, my mother explained during a recent presentation to a group of healthcare providers. But we also had to commit to doing better once we gained that knowledge. The worst part wasn't that we made mistakes. It was the possibility that we might keep making the same mistakes even after we understood the harm they were causing. My father's transformation has been particularly profound. The man who once believed that happiness is a choice and that depression isn't real now volunteers as a peer counselor for other fathers whose children are struggling with mental illness. He's learned to use his natural problem-solving skills to research treatment options, navigate insurance systems, and connect families with appropriate resources. I spent decades thinking that being a good father meant protecting my daughter from weakness, he told a group of parents last week. I had to learn that being a good father actually means protecting her right to be human, including her right to struggle and her right to ask for help when she needs it. The professional path that grew from my personal crisis has continued to expand in unexpected directions. The book Dr. Hayes and I co-authored, When Love Isn't Enough, A Family Guide to Supporting Teenage Mental Health, became a bestseller in the mental health field and is now used as a textbook in graduate programs across the country. The success of the book led to consulting opportunities with communities trying to replicate Willowbrook's model of comprehensive mental health support. I've had the privilege of working with rural towns, urban neighborhoods, and suburban communities, all seeking to transform their approach to mental health from crisis response to prevention and early intervention. Each community faces unique challenges, but the core principles remain the same: reducing stigma through education, increasing access to professional treatment, and empowering families to provide effective support rather than inadvertent harm. 1 of the most rewarding projects has been developing a training program for emergency responders, teaching police officers, firefighters, and paramedics how to recognize and appropriately respond to mental health crises. The program, now implemented in over 50 communities, has significantly reduced unnecessary hospitalizations, arrests, and traumatic encounters between people in crisis and first responders. The work has also led to policy advocacy at the state level. I've testified before legislative committees about the importance of funding rural mental health programs, served on task forces developing guidelines for school-based mental health services, and contributed to research projects examining the effectiveness of community-based approaches to mental health treatment. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of this journey has been witnessing the ripple effects that extend far beyond formal programs and professional initiatives. Young people in Willowbrook now grow up understanding that mental health is as important as physical health, that seeking therapy is as normal as visiting a doctor for any other medical concern, and that emotional struggles are temporary challenges to be addressed rather than permanent character flaws to be hidden. This cultural shift has practical implications that touch every aspect of community life. Our local schools report significant decreases in bullying, increases in academic performance, and improvements in overall student well-being. Local businesses have seen reductions in employee turnover, decreases in workplace conflicts, and increases in productivity as workers feel supported in addressing both personal and professional stressors. The changes have even affected how our community handles major challenges and traumas. When the Willowbrook textile plant closed 2 years ago, eliminating over 200 jobs, the community response included immediate mental health support for affected families alongside traditional employment, assistance, and economic development efforts. Rather than expecting people to tough it out during the crisis, community leaders recognized that economic stress could trigger or worsen mental health conditions and proactively provided resources to address both the practical and emotional impacts of job loss. The anniversary celebration this weekend will feature not just success stories, but honest acknowledgement of the ongoing challenges we face. Mental health treatment remains expensive and sometimes difficult to access, particularly for families without good insurance coverage. Some community members still resist seeking help due to lingering stigma or cultural barriers. The demand for services continues to exceed our capacity, despite significant expansion of programs and staff. We've also learned that transformation is an ongoing process rather than a one-time achievement. Each year brings new challenges, increases in anxiety among young people due to social media pressures, mental health impacts of economic uncertainty, the need to adapt services for our growing immigrant population, the challenge of maintaining funding for programs when other community priorities compete for limited resources. But we've also learned that communities can develop resilience and adaptive capacity that enable them to address these evolving challenges more effectively. The infrastructure we built, both in terms of formal services and community attitudes, provides a foundation for responding to new mental health needs as they emerge. Alex Thornwell's keynote address tomorrow will focus on this theme of ongoing growth and adaptation. His own recovery journey illustrates that mental health isn't about reaching a permanent state of happiness, but about developing the skills, supports, and self-awareness needed to navigate life's inevitable challenges without losing hope or connection to others. "I still have difficult days," he shared during our planning meeting for the anniversary event. "The difference is that now I have tools for managing those days, people I can talk to when I'm struggling, and the knowledge that difficult feelings are temporary rather than permanent. I also know that my struggles don't define me. They're just one part of a life that includes many sources of meaning and joy." As I prepare my own remarks for tomorrow's celebration, I find myself thinking about that letter I wrote 5 years ago, the one that nearly became my final communication with the world. The despair and hopelessness that filled those pages feels almost foreign to me now, like reading about someone else's experience rather than recalling my own. But I don't want to forget that version of myself entirely, because she represents millions of people who are struggling in silence right now, people who feel like their pain isn't valid or serious enough to warrant help, people who have been taught that mental health struggles are character flaws rather than medical conditions. My message to them, and to anyone who might be in the place I was 5 years ago, is simple but profound. Your pain is real. Your struggle is valid. Help is available. Recovery is possible. And your story, whatever it looks like right now, is not over. The letter that once represented my desire to end my story became instead the first chapter of a completely different narrative, one defined not by suffering, but by healing, not by isolation, but by connection, not by despair, but by hope and purpose. To the parents who might be dismissing their child's emotional struggles, I want you to know that love alone isn't enough, but love combined with understanding, education, and professional support can create miracles. To the families torn apart by mental illness, I want you to know that healing and reconciliation are possible when everyone is willing to learn and grow. And to the person reading this who sees themselves in my story, who recognizes the drowning feeling I described, who has written their own version of that letter or considered writing one, I want you to know that the storm you're experiencing right now is not your destination. It's your beginning. 5 years ago, my parents found a letter that almost ended everything. Today, That same crisis has become the foundation for a life I never could have imagined, filled with purpose, connection, and the daily privilege of helping other people find their way from darkness into light. The storm that almost destroyed me ultimately taught me how to fly. Your storm can do the same. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.